No issue of the 20th century aroused more debate, more scholarship, more argument, more partisanship than the question of the origins of the Cold War. When did it begin? Who was to blame? When did it end? Who was involved? Who started it? Who dominated? All of these questions were argued from the beginning to the end of the Cold War, and scholars, even to this day, will have their niche that they argue and fuss and fume as only scholars can do. But historians agree on two questions, and they seem to have gained some kind of consensus on these two questions. Most would agree that the origins of the Cold War can only be understood by examining the context and the events leading up to. It's not an event that just suddenly occurred in 1945, that the wartime allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, had a falling out, and it then led to a almost 50-year struggle of wills. That the antecedents, if you will, of the Cold War are the things that proceed from the beginnings of the Soviet Union until World War II. They're kind of put on a back burner during World War II, but even events during the war led to heighten the tension, so as the war wound down, the two superpowers squared off. So the answer that one question, the first question, most historians agree that you can only understand the Cold War by looking at the legacy of mistrust, and that, secondly, World War II exacerbated conditions that already existed. And so what we will do today is to look at the wartime, the coming of the Cold War, and the wartime alliance structure that led to that legacy of mistrust that would play out through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and in the beginning of the 1990s. Ever since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the United States and the Soviet Union had looked at one another with suspicion. Americans had always been mistrustful and had a high level of animosity toward communism. Communism was one of those European doctrines that had emerged from the 19th century and had swept across Europe and was kind of anathema to many Americans. And so what is communism? Well, communism is an economic, social, and political system in which, in theory, all people are equal. It's the greatest of the egalitarian systems. That all people are equal, that all goods should be distributed equally across the world. Communism, in its ultimate fulfillment, did not recognize national borders. The state, as such, was supposed to fade away. Even in practicality, in practice, the Soviet state of the Soviet Union was supposed to, the political party was supposed to rule until worldwide communism was achieved, and then it was to fade away. But to have equal distribution of goods and services, that's predicated on some key ideologies that Americans hold dear. The first being private property. You can't have private property in a communist system. Religion, as the founders of communism said, Lenin said it was the opiate of the masses. Religion was forbidden in communist Russia. And so with this public ownership of the methods, it tended to be public ownership. It was supposed to be the people owning the methods of production and distribution and then consumption. But in actuality, it was the party. And so America had a long-standing animosity toward the very doctrines of communism. Many viewed it, and still do today, that it stifles, it kills enterprise, it kills hard work. Every time communism has been tried, worker productivity declines. Why? Because you're going to get the same goods, you're going to get the same reward out of it regardless of how hard or how little you work. And so Americans had a fundamental animosity toward communism. That was furthered during World War I as the Soviet Union came into existence and fought the Communist Revolution of 1917. With the revolution being victorious, and even in that revolution itself, the West, the capitalist West, if you want to put it in Stalinist, Leninist terms, or even Trotskyist terms, the capitalist West, to preserve even the totalitarian system of the Tsar, would get involved in the communist revolution and try to prop up the Tsar or other groups in opposition to communism. And so the Soviets had a very, very strong distrust of the United States because the United States had fought against communism in 1917 and 1918. American troops had even invaded the Soviet Union in World War I. American troops had landed in the Soviet Union to convey weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the whites, supporters of the Tsar, who were fighting the Reds, the communists and the Bolsheviks, known as the Bolsheviks. And the communists throughout the Cold War would insist that while communism had never invaded the United States had invaded Mother Russia. And so even World War I brought some animosity. And then, of course, in 1917, as the Communist Revolution wins in Russia and overthrows the Tsar, what happened? Well, immediately the Bolsheviks beseeched Kaiser Wilhelm to implement a peace and bring the war to an end. And the Bolsheviks withdrew from World War I, leaving all of those German troops to be transferred to the Western Front to fight the West. In essence, what Stalin during World War II that we talked about, Stalin's accusation of Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt delaying the opening of a second front so the Germans and the Russians can kill each other off. Well, in essence, that's what the Bolsheviks had done to the West. They had pulled out of the war, signed a draconian peace in the hopes that the Western allies, the Entente powers, and the Central powers would kill each other off. And then Russia would be there to pick up the spoils at the end of the war. And so the separate peace signed between the Soviet Union and Germany in 1917 left a bitter taste in the mouth of the West. So much so that in 1917, Woodrow Wilson refused to recognize the Bolshevik government as the government of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union as being in existence. And so throughout the 19-teens and 1920s into the 1930s, the United States did not recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate government. They ignored it. No diplomatic relations between the two. While at the same time, communist rhetoric focused on the American capitalist system, calling for the worldwide revolution of communism and the export of the Soviet Revolution to all capitalist states. Toward that end, the Soviets established an international organization. You might say it was an organization to give the Soviets cover. The Soviets could say, we're not involved in trying to establish communism in your country. It's that Comintern movement. The Comintern movement would be a meeting of communists from around the world. It's like a modern-day workshop or symposium. They would get together and have sessions on how to overthrow your government, or how to undermine, how to infiltrate labor unions and use the labor unions to bring about the revolution of the working class. And so the Comintern movement, which stands for Communism International, the Comintern movement, every year as it held its meetings, would plot and plan attacks upon the capitalist West. The 1920s, communist subversion in the United States led directly to a bombing attack on the U.S. Attorney General that was traced back to communist sympathizers. Worker unrest agitated by communist infiltrators as the Soviets sought their avowed need for worldwide revolution, the destabilization of the West. And it was fairly hard for the communists to do in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, as capitalism was in its heyday. But then in 1929, it all came crashing down. And throughout the 1930s, the Soviet Union had a fairly easy time recruiting around the world as the world descended into the Great Depression, all except the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't have a Great Depression. Why? Because Stalin said they didn't. And Stalin, as the head of the Soviet state, and the 5-year plans and the 10-year plans didn't allow for a Great Depression. And either way, the Soviet people had so little and were so deprived of creature comforts that they wouldn't have known there was a Great Depression anyway. Their lives were often so miserable. Reminds me of a book I once read by P.J. O'Rourke. I've forgotten the title now, but he talked about traveling in East Germany during the height of the Cold War and looking in at the shops, having come from West Berlin and the vibrant, thriving shops and bars and nightlife and all of the boisterous activity. And then you go to East Germany and it was droll, it was drab. There was no real life, not only in the people, but in the businesses. And so, the Stalinist Comintern movement and use of the Great Depression to undermine the capitalist system, which surprisingly had a surprisingly small effect on the United States. While the Communist Party in the United States did gain some advocates and did grow in size, it didn't grow nearly to the size and proportion that the economic crisis seemed to indicate it should. The American people were first and foremost hard-working and some would say addicted to the capitalist system, the idea of the American dream, that you can do better than your parents. I have another theory, and it's my personal theory, but that the nation was full of immigrants who had come from a Europe that had been exposed to the ideas of communism, and they saw the fruits of it even before the Soviet Revolution, even before the Bolsheviks had taken over. They saw the roots of socialism, they saw the roots of its bigger brother communism, and they rejected it. Add to the distrust and the legacy of disagreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. The world looked on in horror as the Soviet Union, Joe Stalin in particular, held a series of purges throughout the 1930s. Whole segments of the population in the Soviet Union just simply disappeared, were shipped off to Siberia or executed in place. The institution of the pogroms, working villages, isolated and cut off from the rest of the world and told this is what you have to produce. There's no upward mobility in the communist system, especially as practiced by Joe Stalin. And so as millions Millions. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. Joe Stalin killed more of his people than Hitler killed of the Jews and the communists and the Christians and anybody who opposed him. Joe Stalin made Hitler look like a choir boy. Especially as Stalin persecuted and executed minority peoples all across the Soviet Union. And then even purging his own generals, his own leadership. Anybody who might be a challenger or a rival to Stalin's rule were put to death. Even people who were in exile. I was reading this morning about Leon Trotsky, one of the architects of the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. Leon Trotsky would be ultimately exiled first to France and then to Norway and then finally in Mexico. And Stalin, fearful that Trotsky might make a comeback in the Soviet Union, even as late as 1940, had Trotsky assassinated in Mexico, right in a suburb of Mexico City. Stalin harbors no rivals. Then you throw on top of the purges, the show trials that was the Soviet Union. You add to that, the legacy of foreign relations, the withdrawal from World War I, but then you add in the Nazi-Soviet pact, the well-known fact that the Soviets had rearmed Adolf Hitler and the Germans. The Soviets doing everything they can to help Hitler get around the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, wanting and hoping to use Hitler as a tool to destroy the West. And then, of course, the ultimate aim of Stalin would be then to undermine and destroy Hitler. The fact that Hitler would more quickly stab Stalin in the back with Operation Barbarossa came as a total shock and surprise to Stalin. The problem then becomes for the United States, how do you rehabilitate the Soviet Union? So during the wartime years, at least the late 1930s and early 1940s, Franklin Roosevelt had a very difficult time rehabilitating Uncle Joe, your crazy uncle, into a dauntless ally. And so Roosevelt's propaganda hits the airwaves, the radio waves, in publication, in magazines, in speeches, referring to the Soviet Union as their dauntless ally of the United States. And Americans admired the Soviets for standing firm in the face of the Blitzkrieg and Hitler's unrelenting attacks. And then, of course, the United States opened up its pocketbook, opened up its resources, and provided the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease throughout the war. But even with that said, and even with those slight rehabilitation of the Soviet image, there were things during the war that drove a wedge between the United States and the Soviet Union. First was the Soviet invasion of Poland. And they're taking half of Poland in conjunction with Hitler. And then some of the greatest wartime atrocities weren't committed by the Germans. I mean, they did bad enough. But in places like the Katyn Forest, Stalin sent in elite Soviet Union units and wiped out whole Polish villages, and then used weaponry and ammunition to try to frame the Germans. He followed that up with an attack on Finland and the Baltic states. And the United States had always had a love affair with Finland. Finland had been the only country in Europe to repay all of its World War I debt. The United States regularly at Olympic Games, U.S. fans turned out to support Finnish teams. And so there was a natural love relationship between the United States and Finland. And Stalin will try to destroy Finland during the war with a number of invasions, and poor Finland, outnumbered and outgunned, fought on fearlessly against the much larger Soviet Union. Then, of course, you have, during the war, the reports coming back to the Allied High Command about Soviet brutality toward German prisoners of war, captured Germans being sent off to work camps in Siberia rather than being accorded the conventions of war. They were used as slave labor. And then to further add angst to that was the use of American pilots that we talked about with Jimmy Doolittle, one of the planes making it to Soviet territory, only to have the crew held as prisoners of war. And American bombing crews that flew across Germany, dropping bombs on Berlin and other German cities. If they couldn't make it back to England, they could continue flying to Russian lines, but then were held as POWs for the duration of the war. American officers and American doctors were denied access to American pilots being held by the Soviet Union. And even brutal treatment of American allies at the hands of the Soviets as they tried to gather more information about the United States and America's intentions through its pilots and soldiers. And then, of course, you have the angst of the Soviet Union toward the United States for not opening a second front earlier. And so you have this long legacy of mistrust. A legacy of mistrust that is only furthered by the wartime conferences. Ultimately, the problem of the Soviet Union and the United States is a disagreement of their vision of the world. And I've mentioned this in a previous video, but Wendell Willkie, who ran against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 and 1944, published a book in 1943 called One World. And in that book, he spelled out what was Franklin Roosevelt's vision of the post-war world. It was a world in which nations abandoned their traditional beliefs in military alliances and spheres of influence, and instead the world would govern itself through a democratic process, through an international organization. And so what you're going to see in the wartime conferences is a desire to build that post-war democratic organization to take place of the now defunct League of Nations. That every people should have a right to choose the form of government under which they live. And that the world would set up an international organization to serve as the arbiter of disputes and the protectors of the peace. That's the vision of Wendell Willkie and Franklin Roosevelt. One world, ruled ultimately by world government, with the state, the United States being a state government, the state being subordinate to the United Nations. Stalin, on the other hand, saw the world for what it was. And he advocated spheres of influence. He advocated the protection of Mother Russia, as we talked about, and I told you about the book of the Soviet Paradox. That the Soviet Union must protect itself against future aggressions from the West. And so what Stalin then engages in the 40s and 50s is an attempt to isolate the Soviet Union. While trying to export communism to the world, he's trying to isolate the Soviet Union from external attack and external influence. So the first of those wartime conferences is the Atlantic Charter Conference. The Atlantic Charter Conference. We've talked about it briefly, in which Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill would meet at off the coast of Newfoundland on August 14th, 1941, and would establish common cause and a unity of vision for the post-war world. In fact, you've seen a lot of these ideas before. The United States and the United Kingdom would seek no territorial gains. That's denial of reparations. That's a denial of territorial acquisition. That's telling the world, we're not going to try to profit from World War II. Our intention is to defeat Hitler, to defeat Mussolini, to defeat Tojo. But notice, national boundaries adjusted in accord with the peoples concerned. That's straight out of Wilson's 14 points. Self-determination of all people. Once again, straight out of the 14 points. Lowering of all trade barriers. Straight out of the 14 points. Global economic cooperation and an advancement of social welfare. That's a 14-point plus some. Global economic cooperation, that's straight out of 14 points. But then the advancement of social welfare. In other words, progressivism taken to the world stage. The elimination of the world's want and fear. Freedom of the seas, that's a 14-point. And disarmament of aggressor nations and a post-war common disarmament. Meaning, after the war's over, all countries are going to reduce armaments to a set level, but then those nations that have been aggressors are going to be totally disarmed. So that your military becomes, in essence, a police force. And so Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agree on these ideas in principle before the war even begins. Once the war starts, Franklin Roosevelt will call a meeting of the Big Three to meet in Casablanca, Morocco, North Africa. The Casablanca Conference, January 14th, 1943. Operation Torch has been successful. North Africa has been liberated to show the success of the Western Allies. Roosevelt and Churchill meet. Now, it's supposed to be a meeting of the Big Three. But Stalin, to get to Casablanca, would have to fly practically halfway around the globe. Remember, he can't fly directly from the Soviet Union to North Africa. He would fly over German-held territory, and he's a prime target. So he would have to fly in a roundabout way, and this is the height of the defense against the German attacks. And so Stalin declines to be present. So instead, the Free French, designated by the cruciform cross on the French flag, the Free French leaders are invited to attend. And so at the conference, you see the meeting of the Big Two and the French. At the Casablanca Conference, the Allies issue the Casablanca Declaration that the only acceptable alternative of this war is the complete unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. All three of them. There's not going to be any bargaining. There's not going to be any agreements. This was thrown in there to accommodate Stalin. Stalin had this fear that the West would bail on the war. That if Hitler ever offered the West an opportunity for a ceasefire, that Roosevelt and Churchill would take it and leave Germany fighting the Soviet Union alone. Actually, it's probably a genius of an idea, and Hitler should have tried to exploit it. But nonetheless, the Casablanca Declaration says the Allies would accept nothing short of unconditional surrender, and that they're not going to end the conflict before that happens, whether that be Germany, Italy, or Tokyo. Here's the problem for the Soviet Union. If they agree to the Casablanca Conference, then one of the Axis powers they have a non-aggression pact with, and that is Japan. And so another reason that Stalin didn't want to attend here is he doesn't want to put his name to something that could create a two-front war for the Soviets, especially at the key time when Stalingrad is under direct assault. As a sidelight to the Casablanca Conference, the United States demands and wants more offensives in the Pacific, whereas the British want offensives in Europe, so the compromise is more offensives in the Mediterranean. Provide all possible aid to the Soviets. Once again, this is a SOP, a accommodation to Stalin. And then the recognition of joint free French rule under Charles de Gaulle and Henri Giraud. And then finally, agreement with the French that the number of Jews allowed in professional occupations should be restricted to the percentage of Jews in the North African population. As North Africa is liberated, there was a very large Jewish population, especially those who had fled Europe and taken refuge in North Africa, in the Vichy French areas of North Africa. And the Jews had come to dominate a large number of the professions. And so this is actually a restriction on the Jews, that they are not allowed to dominate the professions, but can only have a percentage of the professions as is equal to their percentage in the population. This is a condition demanded by the French for their continued participation. The Casablanca Conference showed solidarity. It showed the Allied commitment, especially the West, to the war conditions and conduct of the war. And they followed that up in November of 1943 with the Tehran Conference. Now, there is a conference, and I didn't put it in here, that is immediately before Tehran. It is the Cairo Conference. The Cairo Conference, which took place just a couple of weeks before the Tehran Conference, involved Churchill, Roosevelt, and Chiang Kai-shek from China. And at the Cairo Conference, it demonstrated the West's commitment to Chinese victory against Japan. Stalin couldn't attend that conference because him attending a conference in which Chiang Kai-shek is present would drive a wedge between Stalin and the communist revolutionary Mao Zedong, and would also anger the Japanese and be a violation of the Non-Aggression Pact. So Stalin sits out the Cairo Conference, but then says, you know, while you're all assembled here, why don't you just fly up to Tehran? The Battle of Stalingrad's over. German forces are being pushed back, so Iran is a good location, close enough to the Soviet Union that Stalin won't be away from Mother Russia for too long. Dictators are fearful about leaving others in charge because they might not be invited back. And so Stalin has to meet close to Mother Russia so that he can keep an eye on his subordinates in case they should get ideas of doing without him. The problem is the Tehran Conference, the first meeting of the big three, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, takes place after the Soviet Union has begun gaining ground and pushing the Germans back. And that was the Americans' biggest bargaining chip, to force the Soviets into compliance with what Roosevelt desired. While Churchill and Roosevelt support the Soviet Union and call for a unified government to be placed in all of the areas that Russia is now liberating, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, all across Eastern Europe, the United States and the British demand a role in those governments. At the same time, the United States and Great Britain are in the process of liberating Italy and setting up a government without allowing the Soviets any input in that government. So there's a large element of hypocrisy that Roosevelt and Churchill want to be involved in all the governments of Eastern Europe, while at the same time not allowing their ally to participate in the creation of a government. Why? Because the government in Italy is going to be a capitalist government. It's going to be a Western-leaning government. Stalin would have insisted that Italian communists need to sit in the government, that they need to have the Communist Party in Italy restructured and rebuilt, and they should have a voice. Churchill and Roosevelt want to avoid that, so they simply don't allow Stalin to play in Italy. So Stalin, he's a practitioner of realpolitik. He knows as he liberates Eastern Europe, he's simply going to refuse to permit the West to participate. Or, more importantly, he'll keep the West on the hook, offering them inducements that they can participate, all the while ensuring that they don't. So at the Tehran conference, a number of things emerge. First off, the support of the Yugoslav partisans. That's simply providing lend-lease material to the Yugoslav partisans so that they can continue being a thorn in the side of southern German flank. The Allies would encourage Turkey to declare war on Germany before the end of 1943, adding yet another ally and another source of contention for the Germans, putting pressure on every front possible. And then the Allies promised to launch a cross-channel invasion before May of 1944. And it would be timed with Soviet attacks in the Eastern Front so that Germany couldn't pull from the Eastern Front to the West and would hopefully pull from the West to the East so that both sides would be successful. Simple fact is, the Allies weren't ready in May of 1944. It won't take place until June. And in fact, while Eisenhower was unsure that the attack should go off on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy, he went anyway, even though the weather conditions were marginal and probably should have been postponed. He went anyway because of the political considerations coming out of the Tehran conference and the pressures being placed on him by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. So FDR promises that the Second Front would begin within 6 months. In addition, Stalin promises that the Soviet Union will become involved with the Japanese in the Pacific, giving no deadlines, but at some point before the end of the war, that the Soviet Union would become involved in the conflict. There was disagreement, though, on what kind of government should be put in Poland, and it was kind of put on the back shelf. As Poland is being liberated, part of the Polish refugees are in Russia, and part of the former Polish government is in London. London Poles versus Lublin Poles. Stalin claims the Lublin Poles are the legitimate government of Poland. Churchill claims the London Poles are the legitimate government of Poland and they should be restored to their proper place. So they agree to disagree at the Tehran conference. So while Tehran in the whole is successful, you see the cracks starting to develop. And the primary cause is the reestablishment of governments in those countries taken by Axis powers. The next wartime meeting, the second wartime meeting of the Big Three, and the fourth wartime conference, and depending on how you count it, so I wouldn't count them 1, 2, 3, 4, would be the Yalta Conference, sometimes referred to as the Crimea Conference of February 4th, 1945. This is the big conference. This is the one in which major issues are to be settled. The war is winding down. Everyone can see the handwriting on the wall in Europe. But at the same time, the war in the Pacific is going full force, and it looks like it could drag on for a long time yet. The first principle that they agree on is that after Germany's surrender, Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones. Now, originally there were 3. The United States and Great Britain insisted on a 4th. And Joe Stalin said, fine, if you want France to have an occupation zone, it has to come out of yours. And so the French will be allowed to participate in the occupation of Germany after the war. Stalin insists that Germany would be demilitarized and denazified, meaning Nazis would be removed from positions of control and positions of government. Anyone who had been a Nazi will be refused participation in the government. In reality, that never happened. There simply was not enough qualified people in Germany for the whole government to be denazified. And so there would be graduated standards of who could participate and who couldn't. Stalin insisted on reparations from Germany, and that part of that reparation would be enforced labor. This really became an issue with Roosevelt and Churchill. The idea of slave labor being used, but how could they stop it? So to get Stalin's agreements, especially on fighting in the Pacific, they went along with him. You know, look at how this plays out. The other day I was passing the post office, and at the post office there was the U.S. flag flying, and beneath the U.S. flag was another flag, the black flag of the POW MIAs. And in thinking about that, that really comes out of this time period. Now the flag and the observance and remembrance of those who were prisoners of war and missing in action comes from Vietnam. But who were we fighting in Vietnam? Well, we were fighting the North Vietnamese, trained by the Russians. But it's also to remember the Korean War. Who were we fighting there? The North Koreans, who were trained by the Russians. And one of the things both groups learned from Russia was to exploit and use prisoners of war. We know for a fact the Soviet Union had German POWs from World War II still working as slave labor in the 1970s, 30 years after the war had come to an end. And so a part of it is our own fault. German reparations would be partly enforced labor. The Russians descend on conquered East Germany and their zone of control like a plague of locusts. They take everything that's not nailed down and even some things that are. Russian engineers came in and took pictures of factories and drew up blueprints of factories in Germany, then disassembled them and reassembled them in Russia. Reparations in kind. You destroyed our factory, we're going to take your factory. One of my colleagues, Dr. Gaida, when she teaches Russian history, tells of the thousands of Russian soldiers headed back to Mother Russia, carrying any porcelain toilet, porcelain sink, or porcelain bathtub they could find. These things were unknown in Soviet Russia. And so to have an actual potty, an actual toilet to sit on, even if it wasn't connected to a sewer system, it had to be put in an outhouse. It was still more comfortable than the wooden bench or squatting out back. And so the Russians descend on Germany at the end of the war like a plague of locusts, and they take everything, people and stuff. There is some agreement on Poland. Poland would be based on the communist provisional government of Poland. But Stalin promised that there would be a broadening of the government and the West would have a say. That's not going to happen, by the way. An adjustment of Poland's borders. Stalin's agreed to participate in the United Nations, but he wants membership for all 16 Soviet republics, not just the Soviet Union. While he controls them all, he wants separate votes for all of them, giving Stalin a huge voting bloc in the UN. That doesn't happen. And then Stalin promises to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat, and that they would hunt down Nazi war criminals. So one of the major causes of the Cold War is the division of Europe between East and West. And you can see on the map where Soviet control is going to take root, and then where the West and Western control takes root. And the focal point of that is going to be Berlin and Germany. And you can see President Truman and Premier Stalin dueling with toothpicks over Europe. And I say Truman because on April the 12th, 1945, after Roosevelt returned from the Yalta Conference, he addresses a joint session of Congress. And in that joint session of Congress, Roosevelt struggled to put words together. He struggled to present ideas. The always eloquent Roosevelt obviously was fatigued. And as he finished his address to the Congress, he announces that he is going to go to his southern home in Warm Springs, Georgia. The side story to that is his mistress was meeting him in Warm Springs, Georgia. And after arriving in Warm Springs, Georgia, and meeting with his mistress and others, Roosevelt really seemed to be having problems on the night of April the 11th. And then on April the 12th, as Roosevelt tried to make cocktails, he had a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died. With the death of Roosevelt, Vice President Harry Truman becomes president. Harry Truman is not a Roosevelt. He is unlike Roosevelt, as any president has differed from his vice president. As one reporter said, with Roosevelt, you'd have known he was president even if you hadn't been told. He looked imperial. He acted that way and he talked that way. Harry Truman, for God's sake, looked and acted and talked like, well, he talked like a failed haberdasher. Haberdasher's a clothing salesman, and that's exactly what Harry Truman was, a clothing salesman. But Harry Truman was now President of the United States, and he would meet with our erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, for the first time July 18th, 1945. You can see General of the Army Dwight Eisenhower and Lieutenant General Lucius Clay arriving in Potsdam, Germany. Eisenhower as the Supreme Allied Commander in the West, Lucius Clay as the commander of Berlin. The war has now come to an end in Germany, and it's a matter of dictating the peace. How will the wartime allies function now that the war's over? As the conference begins on July 17th, you see the old guard, or at least some of the old guard, Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, and Joe Stalin. But no sooner does the conference start than elections in Great Britain, the Labour Party unseats the Conservative Party. Clement Attlee is going to replace Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of Great Britain. In the Potsdam Conference, the key conference of the war, the agreement was made to partition Vietnam, an area controlled by the Japanese at the 17th parallel, that Germany would be demilitarized, denazified, democratized, decentralized, and decartelized, meaning Germany would be forever divided and turned into a nation of farmland. Stalin did not want Germany to become industrial again. That's not going to happen, by the way. Germany very quickly will be re-industrialized because of the Cold War. Germany and Austria would be partitioned into 4 zones, and Berlin and Vienna would each be controlled by the 4 powers. Again, Nazi war criminals would be prosecuted. The Nuremberg war trials is a carrying out of that. The German populations would be expelled from Eastern Europe, so there would be no Germans to lead to another war. They would all be focused in Germany. There was an agreement that Russia was due reparations, but that it would come out of the Soviet zone. That the German standard of living could never exceed the European average. And it called for the destruction of German industrial war potential. They could produce nothing that could be turned into factories that could produce war goods. The West gives in and recognizes the Lublin Poles as controlling Poland. the London polls, sorry, Charlie, you're out. And then finally, the Potsdam Declaration, that Japan would be disarmed, Japan's territory would be reduced, Japan would be occupied after the war, criminal trials would take place against Japanese war criminals, and Japan was called upon for immediate unconditional surrender. As we talked about in the last video, though, that did not happen, and on August 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay drops Little Boy on Hiroshima. Japan still refused to surrender, and on August the 8th, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan, and then August 9th, the plane Boxcar drops the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. With that, Japan sues for peace. You can see the signers, even the Soviet signer of the surrender documents, with the United States going to dominate the post-war Japanese government. But on the periphery of the Japanese empire, in China, Korea, and Vietnam, it would be divided between the wartime allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, which would lead to future conflict. Next time.